How the poor healed without doctors. Forgotten wisdom of the body. The body always knew what to do. Before hospitals. Before pills came in blister packs. Before white coats and waiting rooms, there was the body. And there were those who listened to it. The poor did not have access to doctors. They did not rely on prescriptions. Often, they couldn't even read the labels on a jar. But they knew when the body was asking for rest. When a cough was more than a cough. When a fever was not an enemy, but a message. They didn't need machines to understand health. They had intuition, observation, patience, and above all presence. They knew how to touch a forehead and tell whether it was time for a warm compress or a cold cloth. They could smell the breath and detect imbalance. They knew when a child's silence was more than tiredness. They noticed everything because survival depended on it. Their remedies were simple. Hot tea, a quiet room, a damp cloth, a whispered prayer, a story told softly in the dark, and sometimes nothing more than time. When someone fell ill, the entire home adjusted. Voices lowered, curtains were drawn, fires were stoked slower. Meals became lighter, filled with herbs and warm broth. Even the dogs outside seemed to know something sacred was happening inside. There was no rush to fix the body. They trusted it to know its way back. They just cleared the path, gently, lovingly, quietly. A sore throat meant lemon and honey. A cold meant thick socks, boiled ginger root, and time beneath a heavy blanket. A fever was met not with fear, but with reverence. The fever was the fire of the body. It burned away what didn't belong. And while it burned, everyone stayed close, not with panic, but with care. There was always an elder. Always a grandmother with lines like rivers on her face. Always a neighbor who had the touch. Always someone who had seen more illness than years. These women carried stories, not from books, but from skin, breath, and bone. They knew which leaf cooled and which leaf warmed. They knew how to brew calm into a teacup. And more than anything, they knew how to sit still beside the sick, listening to the body speak. Sometimes they would say, "Let the body speak first, then you'll know what to do." And they were right. There were no charts, no machines, no hourly checklists. Only patience, only trust, only love. They didn't ask, "What's the diagnosis?" They asked, "What does this body need right now?" And then they gave it. They gave it silence, warmth, slowness, space, and company. Today, healing feels like a race. Back then, it was a ritual. They believed. The body didn't break, it paused. It stopped us when we ran too far from ourselves. It whispered first, then raised its voice. And if we still didn't listen, it lay us down. So we would finally hear. The poor knew how to hear. Not with ears, with hearts. They had no distractions, no phones ringing, no deadlines. Only the fire crackling, the kettle whistling, and the breath of the one they loved, softening in the night. Even the beds knew how to hold the sick. Hard, yes, thin maybe, but covered in handmade blankets, woven with quiet hope. Children were taught not to fear illness, but to greet it as a guest, to ask it gently, "What did you come to teach?" And when the lesson was done, the guest left and the body returned. Not always stronger, but always wiser, more tender, more aware of its limits, more grateful for simple things like soup, sleep, and sunlight. This is the wisdom we forgot, that healing is not about force. It's not about silencing the symptom. It's about hearing what the symptom is trying to say. The poor didn't heal because they had remedies. They healed because they had time. They had faith. They had each other. And most of all, they had the courage to trust the body, because the body always knew all it ever needed was someone who remembered how to listen. The house became the hospital. There was no clinic down the road, no doctor on call, no ambulance to summon when the fever rose, but the poor were never without help. Because when someone fell ill, the house itself transformed. It became a hospital, a chapel, a sanctuary, a nest. Every corner of the home rearranged itself, not physically, but spiritually. The very air became slower. The walls seemed to breathe more gently, and the floorboards carried footsteps with a new kind of reverence. No one had to be told. Everyone simply knew it was time to move differently. Time to move with care. The mother became a healer. She pulled the curtains closed just enough to soften the light, but left them cracked, because even sickness needs the sun. She lit the stove early, boiling water not for meals, but for steam, for tea, for compresses, for breath. She touched the forehead of her child, not just to feel heat, but to let the child know, you're not alone in this. The father, often silent, moved with intention. He chopped wood without the usual rhythm. He stacked it quietly. He brought it inside as if he were carrying something sacred. He didn't ask questions. He didn't give advice. He simply did what was needed, and his stillness was medicine too. The older sibling fetched herbs from the garden or woods. They knew the names not from books, but from their mother's mouth. Yarrow, guaco, lemongrass, elderflower, even weeds, when picked with respect, became part of the ritual. The youngest children watched. They learned not through instruction, but by being immersed in care. They saw how the house breathed differently when someone was ill. And even they became quieter, walking softer, playing in whispers, aware that healing needed space. The room of the sick became sacred. Not for its luxury, but for its love. There was a chair near the bed, always occupied. If not by a person, then by a prayer left behind. The bed, though thin, was layered with intention. Blankets warmed by the fire. Pillows fluffed with whispered hopes. Bowls of water beside it, some for drinking, some for cooling fevered skin, some for rituals not fully understood but deeply respected. And the grandmother, if she was present, became the axis around which the entire house turned. She didn't bustle. She didn't worry aloud. She moved like time itself, slow, deliberate, ancient. She whispered things no one else could hear. She stirred herbs in boiling water and muttered words as old as the soil. She placed her hand on the chest of the sick and closed her eyes, listening not for breath, but for spirit. The house held all of this. It didn't need white walls or fluorescent lights to be a hospital. Its bricks held warmth. Its windows held light. Its silence held healing. Even the animals seemed to know. The dog curled closer to the wall. The cat slept near the feet of the bed, never touching, just watching. And the birds outside grew quiet. When someone inside needed rest, sometimes a neighbor would come. With gossip. Not with fear, but with a pot of soup, with a fresh piece of cloth, with a prayer already half spoken in her heart. She wouldn't knock loudly. She would stand at the door, and when welcomed in, she would remove her shoes, lower her voice, and add her calm to the room. In those moments, there was no hierarchy, no difference between roles, no sense of who was more important. Everyone was part of the cure. The one who stirred the broth, the one who boiled the leaves, the one who sat in silence, the one who opened the window when the room got too still. Each was essential. And perhaps the greatest medicine of all was that no one was ever left alone. Illness wasn't isolated. It was witnessed, shared, held, not out of obligation, but out of instinct, because healing, they knew, was never a solitary act. It needed witnesses, hands, eyes that didn't look away, hearts that stayed when things got slow and uncomfortable. When the sick one slept, someone stayed in the room. Not to watch, but to be there if the soul stirred. When they cried, no one rushed to hush them. The tears were sacred, part of the fever's release, part of the story the body needed to tell. No one interrupted the healing. They simply gave it room. And when, days or weeks later, the color returned to the cheeks, when the appetite returned, when the eyes opened without struggle, the house rejoiced, but quietly, gently. There were no balloons, no loud declarations, just a warm meal, a deep breath. A smile passed between mother and father. And maybe, just maybe, a song hummed near the window. One the sick person remembered from childhood. Soft, familiar, alive. The house would return to its rhythm. But it would never be quite the same. It had held something sacred. It had held the edge between breath and no breath. And it had held it well. In that kind of house, the walls didn't need degrees or titles. They only needed love, time, stillness, and people who remembered that healing is something we do together. The medicine of touch. Long before healing was measured in milligrams and milliliters, there were hands. Hands that soothed. Hands that listened. Hands that held pain not to fix it, but to remind it, you are not alone. Among the poor, where there were no tools of metal or machines that beeped, there was touch. And touch was everything. It was the grandmother's hand on a child's forehead, measuring heat not in numbers, but in instinct. It was the father's thick, work-worn palm resting on a fevered chest, transferring strength without a word. It was the mother's fingers moving in slow circles across a child's back, her silence saying more than any lullaby. Touch was there. Medicine, and they knew exactly how to use it. Aching joints were met with warm oil and slow pressure, kneaded into the skin until the body remembered it was loved. Cramps were softened by hands pressing gently on the belly, their rhythm syncing with breath, with heartbeat, with stillness. Even infants, too young to speak, settled under the quiet spell of a touch that asked nothing of them, only offered warmth, security, presence. No one rushed. There was no timer, no 10 minutes of therapy. Healing wasn't measured. It was given. Sometimes they would boil herbs in water and soak cloth in the fragrant steam, then lay it gently on the skin. Not too hot, not too cold. Just enough to tell the body, I'm here, you can let go now. There were no clinical names for this, no textbooks. Just generations of remembering. Of watching grandmothers massage temples with rosemary oil when headaches came. Of seeing an old uncle rub garlic on the soles of feet when a cough refused to leave. Of hearing stories of women who could pull pain from limbs with nothing more than their hands and quiet prayers. And it wasn't magic. It was attention. The body they knew spoke a language. And touch was the only way to answer back, even when death came near, even when nothing more could be done. They didn't step away. They came closer. They touched the face, the hands, the feet, gently, as if blessing each part goodbye, because they understood. A body doesn't stop needing touch when it stops needing healing. It needs it more. For the poor, there were no sterile gloves, no antiseptics, but there was trust. And touch given with trust has always been more powerful than touch given with fear. A mother with cracked fingers from laundry still knew how to hold a child in fever. A grandfather with trembling hands still knew how to press on the center of the palm to calm a racing heart. A sister barely older than the sick child knew to rub circles on the back when nightmares came. It wasn't about precision. It was about intention. In winter, when cold settled into bones like grief, they would soak feet in basins of salt water and eucalyptus, then dry them with soft cloths and massage them until color returned. Not just to the toes, but to the soul. When breathing was tight, they would rub warm oil across the chest, whispering old rhymes not found in books. Rhymes that carried comfort. Rhymes that made the breath remember its rhythm. And when nothing else helped, when the fever held tight, when the pain didn't yield, they still touched. Not to heal, but to honor. That kind of touch says, I see you, even now. Especially now. And the body, so often overlooked in struggle, would respond. Not always with recovery, but with a softening, with a sigh. With one more night of rest. Touch carried stories too. Scarred hands holding young hands told of survival, of resilience, of endurance passed from skin to skin when two palms met. Even for a moment, there was transfer of memory, of presence, of quiet power. They didn't need words. The poor rarely wasted breath when touch could do more. A hand on the back during grief, a finger tracing the curve of the brow in illness, a full embrace when healing began. Each gesture a prayer without syllables. Today, we have forgotten. We fear contact. We rush past each other with screens between us. But the body has not forgotten. It still longs for what those old hands once offered. We now pay for massages, for therapy, for attention. But what they had was free. And somehow more precious. Because it came wrapped not in expertise, but in love. And love, when given through touch, reminds the body that it belongs, that it is not alone, that it is not broken, that it is held, and that sometimes being held is all the healing we need, the healing power of silence. There are kinds of silence that feel empty, cold, lonely, but the poor knew a different kind. A kind of silence that was alive, soft, listening. A kind of silence that could heal. When someone fell ill, it wasn't just the voices that softened. It was everything. The footsteps became slower. The pans clanged less. The air itself seemed to hush. No one was told to be quiet. They just were. It was understood that healing needed space. That noise pressed on wounds, but silence let them breathe. There was no beeping from machines. No bright screens with numbers, just a candle's flicker, a shallow breath, and the unspoken rhythm of time moving differently. Mothers moved like water, flowing in and out of rooms with a grace that didn't disturb. Fathers spoke less, not out of detachment, but out of reverence. And children, sensing the shift, learned to whisper instead of shout. Silence wasn't a punishment. It was a kind of prayer, a way to say, we are listening to what the body has to say. When fevers rose, the house grew still. Not from fear, but from a sacred waiting. The kind that trusts something important is unfolding, even if unseen. Sometimes, the only sounds were those of healing. The boiling of tea on the stove, the soft folding of blankets, the scraping of a spoon in a wooden bowl. And in that quiet, the body listened to. It listened to itself. It heard its own pain, its own rhythm, its own voice beneath the noise. The poor understood that pain doesn't always ask for answers. Sometimes it just asks to be held, not explained, not interrupted, just honored. And silence, true silence, does exactly that. There were days when no one spoke more than a sentence or two, when the whole house moved like a single breath, when a hand on the shoulder said more than 1,000 words. No one asked the sick person, "How do you feel?" They watched. They listened. They noticed the shift in color, in the pace of breathing, in the way eyes opened and closed. Silence allowed those signs to be seen. Noise would have drowned them. It was in that quiet that the grandmother whispered her prayers. Barely audible, but thick with meaning. It was in that quiet that a child's fever eased, not because someone said the right thing, but because no one said the wrong thing. The body responded to stillness. It trusted it, because stillness gave it room. Today, we rush in with words. We fill the space. We try to comfort with stories, with advice, with noise. But often, the greatest comfort is simply presence. To sit beside someone and say nothing. To breathe beside them. To hold space with your stillness. That is medicine the poor knew well. They didn't read about it. They lived it. They learned it by necessity, when there was nothing to say, nothing to do, except stay. Staying is harder than it sounds. Staying in silence, harder still. But it is there, in the quiet moments, that healing begins to unfold. Sometimes, the sick would speak, and the room would hold its breath to hear. Other times they would cry soft, slow tears. No one rushed to wipe them. Tears, too, are medicine. And sometimes there was only breath. The long, slow exhale of someone finally resting. And in response, another breath from the mother, the father, the child nearby, not matching but accompanying. A silent agreement. I'm here, keep breathing. At night, the silence grew even deeper. Only the wind outside. Only the crack of cooling wood. Only the occasional murmur of someone turning in their sleep. And yet, within that hush, so much was happening. The body, finally unobserved by chatter, could speak freely. The heart, no longer strained by worry, could soften. The mind, no longer pushed to explain, could rest. In that silence, healing made its way through the bones, through the blood, through the breath. And when morning came and light returned through the crack of the door, the silence lifted, but never completely. Because once a house had known that kind of quiet, it never forgot. The walls remembered. The floorboards held it. And the people, they carried that hush inside them, even as they laughed again. They knew now, there's a time to speak and a time to listen. A time to act and a time to be still. A time to cure and a time to let healing find its own way. The poor had little, but what they did have, time, touch, presence, and silence, they gave with open hands. And in return, the body so often ignored whispered back, I remember how to heal. Thank you for listening. Time was the healer, the medicine of waiting. In a world without clocks on every wall, time moved differently. It wasn't counted. It was felt. And among the poor, time was not something to fight against. It was something to trust. Because they knew what so many forget. Healing cannot be rushed. It was never 3 days and back to work. It was never take this twice a day and move on. It was a long unfolding. A sacred waiting. A rhythm that followed the body, not the calendar. When someone fell ill, no one demanded improvement by morning. They simply made space. They prepared the house for days, even weeks of slowness. And they honored that slowness as part of the cure. A child with fever stayed in bed as long as needed. There was no urgency to get back to school, no shame in needing extra sleep. Rest was not weakness. It was wisdom. An elder with aches was not told to push through. They were given quiet. Warm compresses, soup, stories, even when there was work to be done, the family adjusted. Someone else fetched the water. Someone else fed the chickens. Because one person's healing was everyone's responsibility. And so, they waited. Not with anxiety, but with faith. Faith in the body's intelligence. Faith in nature's process. Faith that all things heal in their own time. They had no illusion of control. They didn't expect a leaf to grow faster just because. They willed it. So why expect that of the body? Instead, they watched, observed, tended. And like farmers waiting for rain, they trusted the body's seasons, even when it made no sense. Even when improvement seemed invisible. They stayed. They sat beside the sick, not to fix them, but to bear witness as time did its quiet work. Sometimes it was slow. Agonizingly so. The fever lingered. The appetite stayed away. The pain held on. And still, they waited. They waited through long nights of sweat-soaked sheets, through days of restless silence, through weeks of barely their progress, because they knew that true healing doesn't always show itself at first. Sometimes it happens deep inside, in the marrow, in the spirit, in the places no one can see. And so they didn't ask for proof. They didn't demand speed. They simply stayed the course. The grandmother might say, let the sickness walk its path. It knows where it's going. Or the old man might murmur, the body is rebuilding something, don't rush it. They had nothing but time, and they made it into medicine. They understood that a body pushed too fast would falter again. that a soul hurried through pain would carry it longer, that even when the fever broke, the spirit needed time to catch up. So they gave it that time. They let the days stretch. They let the nights unfold. They marked progress not by milestones, but by tiny changes. The way someone sat up a little taller. The way their voice returned, just slightly. The way they asked for more broth. Each sign was met with quiet celebration. A glance exchanged, a hand on the shoulder, a soft smile. No fireworks. Just reverence. Because when you've waited for the body to come back, even the smallest return feels like a miracle. And when healing finally arrived, not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper, they received it gently. They didn't rush back into life. They eased into it, step by step, day by day. And when the sick were finally well, they carried that slowness with them, as a memory in the bones, as a rhythm in the breath, as a reminder. Healing never comes on command. It comes when it's ready. Today, we've lost that art. We measure recovery in hours. We feel guilty for resting. We try to outpace the pain, but the poor knew better. They knew that time, when honored, does what no medicine can. It teaches the body that it is safe. It teaches the soul that it is seen. It teaches the heart that it is not alone. And in that sacred pause, when no one is demanding, when no one is hurrying, when no one is watching the clock, healing happens, slowly, faithfully, fully, because time, when given freely, becomes the greatest healer of all. Healing was shared when the whole community cared. Among the poor, illness was never a private affair. There were no closed doors, no isolation, no silent suffering behind curtains. When someone fell ill, the news didn't need to travel far, because the community was already listening. It was attuned to shifts, to quiet absences, to the hush in a child's footsteps, to the way smoke no longer rose from a neighbor's chimney in the morning. And when it was clear someone needed help, the response came without summons. They arrived. Slowly, respectfully, with broth in pots wrapped in cloth, with herbs tied in bundles, with warm loaves of bread, with soft-spoken prayers already murmuring from their lips. These people were not trained nurses. They were mothers, cousins, godparents, old friends. They brought no credentials, only presence. And presence was everything. They did not knock loudly. They stood at the doorway, waiting for a nod, for a gesture, for the silent permission that said, "Come in." And when they did, they came not as saviors, but as extensions of the house. They folded into the rhythm already unfolding. If there was laundry to wash, they washed it. If the fire was low, they added wood. If the sick were sleeping, they stayed quiet, occupying corners like guardians of peace. Sometimes they sat. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they simply touched a shoulder and left again. Their help wasn't about doing grand things. It was about sharing the weight of worry, the weight of time, the weight of waiting. In this shared labor of care, no one burned out, because no one carried it alone. Even the children played a part. They ran to fetch the herb woman from the edge of the village. They picked flowers for the sick one's bedside. They sat quietly with their cousins, learning by example how to love in stillness. The healing was distributed into each task, into each person, into the very walls of the house. And when a grandmother from down the road came to offer a prayer, she did not speak as an outsider. She entered with reverence, knowing she was not just stepping into a room, but into a sacred process. She might lay her hands on the feet of the sick, or tie a red ribbon near the door to ward off what does not belong. And her prayer, quiet, circular, full of pauses, wrapped itself around the bed like a second blanket. Not everyone believed in the same symbols, but all believed in care, in proximity, in the undeniable medicine of showing up. And sometimes, the most powerful healing came not from plants or oils, but from the simple act of not letting someone be alone with their pain. When a child was burning with fever, 3 women might sit around the fire boiling water and telling quiet stories. Not to distract, but to soften the air. To make the house feel safe. When an elder was slipping into the far places of the mind, neighbors came not to correct, but to remember. To remind them of names, of seasons, of songs from long ago. And when grief loomed, when the healing didn't come, they stayed anyway. They helped bury. They helped clean. They helped hold the silence, because in a poor community, the line between healing and mourning was not sharp. Both required company. Both required tenderness. Both required time. The poor understood. A body can be wounded by loneliness just as deeply as by illness. And so they treated loneliness with the same seriousness, the same presence, the same urgency. If someone was struggling alone, a neighbor appeared, not to fix, but to witness. Sometimes they would say, "I can't heal you, but I can sit with you while your body remembers how." And that sitting, that waiting, that ordinary loyalty was holy. It reminded the sick, "You are still part of us. You haven't been cast out. We are still your people." In a world where survival depended on one another, the wound of being forgotten was too dangerous, too heavy, too cruel. So they never let it happen. Even when food was scarce, a bowl was set aside. Even when time was short, an hour was made. Even when words failed, presence never did. And when healing finally came, when the sick one stood again, walked again, smiled again, it was not just their victory. It belonged to all. To the ones who brought broth, to the ones who watched over fevered nights, to the ones who walked 2 miles just to offer a story or a song, and no one asked for thanks. Because healing was never about transaction. It was about being human, about remembering what the body already knows, that we are made to carry each other, to sit close when things fall apart, to return again and again until the light returns. When prayers were part of the prescription, among the poor, prayer was never a last resort. It wasn't what you did after the medicine failed. It was part of the medicine. It came with the tea, with the warm cloth, with the silence, with the waiting. Prayer lived in the rhythm of care. It was the breath between spoonfuls, the whisper behind closed eyes, the murmur that wrapped itself around the fever and stayed until dawn. To the poor, prayer wasn't superstition. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't noise. It was presence. It was the invisible thread holding the body and soul together when both felt like they were slipping apart. No one needed to be told how to pray. They knew, from childhood, from the way their grandmother's lips moved over the same phrases every night, from the way their father removed his hat when thunder roared too close, from the way every meal, no matter how small, began with silence and ended with gratitude. When illness came, so did the prayers, not shouted, not begged, but spoken with the deep, grounded certainty of people who had lost much and still believed. There were prayers for fever, prayers for sleep, prayers for the mind to clear, prayers whispered over herbs before they were brewed, prayers spoken under breath while a hand rested on the chest of a sick child. Some were full of words. Others were just sounds. And some were only silence held with such devotion. It became a kind of sacred language. There were stories of women who healed with nothing but prayer. They would sit beside the bed, eyes closed, hands open, rocking back and forth like waves, whispering to something greater than themselves, not commanding, not bargaining, just communing. And sometimes the fever broke, not always, but often enough that no one doubted. Something unseen was listening. They didn't need proof. They had presence, and presence was proof enough. When words were used, they were often old, passed down, softened by time, stripped of grandeur. Bless this body and bring it peace. Let the pain lift like fog. Let the bones remember what it means to be whole. Or even simpler still, stay with us. Let her rest. Let him heal. They prayed over the water before it was sipped. They prayed over the bed before the sick lay down. They prayed over the doors, the windows, the corners of the room, as if asking the house itself to help, and perhaps it did, because prayer for the poor was not a request. It was an offering, a way of saying, I will not pretend to control this, but I will stay, I will love. I will call out, not because I fear, but because I care. It wasn't only the old who prayed. Children did too. Sometimes copying their mother's words, sometimes inventing their own. Please make my sister better. She's too quiet. Make the pain go out the window. Give back the color to her cheeks. These were not childish. They were pure. And purity, in a prayer, is the truest kind of power. There was no shame in faith. No embarrassment in asking the unseen for help. Among the poor, need and reverence walked hand in hand. Even those who weren't sure what they believed still bowed their heads, still held the silence, still sat beside the one who prayed, because the act itself was healing. Sometimes the prayer was a song, a hum that rose from the belly and warmed the room. It might have been a lullaby once. Now it was medicine, and when the healing came, as it often did, they didn't credit themselves. They didn't boast. They lit a candle. They offered thanks. They whispered, we're grateful. We're still here. Even when the healing didn't come, when death came instead, they still prayed. Not for the body now, but for the soul. For safe passage, for peace, for meaning. Prayer wrapped itself around every stage, every illness, every life. It filled the cracks where medicine could not reach. It brought softness where pain had made everything sharp. It reminded the sick, you are more than this moment. You are not alone. You are seen by us and by something greater. In a world where so much was uncertain, where pain came often and answers came rarely, prayer was the one thing they always had to give. And in that giving, they became part of the healing. Because when the body is failing, when the night is long, when the medicine has done all it can, what's left is presence. And prayer is presence made holy. When the body and the earth were one, the poor never saw the earth as separate. To them, it was not a place they walked upon, it was a part of them. A skin beneath the skin, a breath beneath the breath. And when the body hurt, they turned to the ground, not as a last resort, but as the first place of knowing, because the earth, they believed, remembered what the body had forgotten. A woman with aching bones would sit under the sun, palms pressed to the soil, and whisper, take some of it if you can. I've carried it long enough. A child with fever was wrapped in cloth, steeped in leaf and bark, the plants chosen not by science, but by memory, by instinct, by stories told beside fires and over garden fences. The poor didn't need laboratories. They had fields, forests, the backyards thick with dandelion and mint. They didn't measure dosage in milligrams, but in handfuls, in steeping time, in scent, in the way the leaves curled or didn't. To them, nature was not passive. It was responsive. If the stomach was sick, they asked the earth for bitter herbs. If the breath was tight, they boiled eucalyptus and pine. If the heart was heavy, they crumbled lavender between their fingers and inhaled its memory. Healing was a conversation, not a conquest. They didn't use the earth. They asked it. They thanked it. Even when they pulled weeds for tea, they did it gently, with respect, with a kind of reverence city people might call foolish, but the body knew the difference. It always knew. They walked barefoot not for leisure, but to feel something stable beneath them. They believed that when the body trembled, the ground could steady it, that when the mind was lost, the wind could carry the confusion away, that when the soul was wounded, the scent of fresh rain could remind it, you are still here, you are still whole. And so they healed in gardens, under trees, on porches with sunlight cutting through cracked boards. Not because they couldn't afford clinics, but because the clinic was already there, growing wild and quiet and unnoticed by those too busy to see. They used clay for swelling, salt from the ocean for wounds, ashes for skin, smoke for spirit. They planted certain flowers not just for beauty, but because they whispered healing into the air. And when the flowers bloomed, they believed healing was near. There was no separation between body and world. If the moon was full, they waited before cutting herbs. If a storm was coming, they harvested fast, not out of superstition, but out of a rhythm learned by centuries of watching, of listening. They didn't say holistic. They didn't say organic. They just lived that way. When someone was sick, they might say, "The body is out of rhythm with the earth. Let's bring it back." And to do that, they brought the body to water, to wind, to trees, to silence. Sometimes healing came through food, thick broths made with bones and roots. Sometimes it came from fasting, letting the body pause so it could speak again. Sometimes it came from the smoke of burned herbs, wafted through rooms and over skin, cleansing not just the air, but the memory. They used what they had: a leaf, a root, a piece of bark, a stretch of sunlight, a morning breeze. But more than that, they used relationship. They were not above nature. They were within it, the same way the lungs are within the breath. And so healing came not just from what they took from the earth, but from what they gave it. They returned ashes to the soil. They composted what could feed the next season. They taught their children to harvest only what was needed, to walk softly, to say thank you, even to a plant. And when death came, as it always does, they returned the body to the same earth that had always cared for it, gently, lovingly, without fear. Because to them, the body was just earth in another shape, just breath held for a little while, just a story the soil had agreed to carry for a time. They did not dread that return. They honored it. But until that day, they healed with what the earth offered, not with dominance, but with dialogue. And the body, grateful for being seen not as a machine, but as a garden, began to bloom again. When healing included the soul, to the poor, a cough was never just a cough. A fever never stood alone. A body in pain often pointed to something deeper: unspoken sorrow, unhealed memory, a story too heavy for the chest to carry. They didn't use words like psychosomatic or emotional trauma. They didn't need to. They just knew if the soul is wounded, the body follows. And so healing was never just about stopping symptoms. It was about softening the ache that lived behind the eyes, the tightness in the throat when grief had nowhere to go, the stomach that turned because fear hadn't been named, the body that slept for days because the spirit had collapsed from carrying too much. Among the poor, you didn't just ask what hurt. You asked what had happened. Did something frighten her? Has he lost someone? Has the silence been too long? Has she been alone too often? Because they knew the soul speaks through the skin, through the bones, through the breath that shortens when words are swallowed too many times. And so, when someone fell ill, they didn't just look for herbs. They looked for burdens, for unfinished mourning, for anger stuck behind the ribs, for secrets that grew heavy in the night. Sometimes, the cure came in the form of storytelling. The sick were invited to speak, not to confess, but to release, to give shape to the invisible pain that had been pressing on the lungs, the back, the joints. They would say, "Tell me when it started," and the voice might tremble, but the truth would come. And with it, space. Sometimes, the cure came in the form of tears. Tears not chased away, but welcomed, held. No one said, "Don't cry." They said, "Let it out." Because they knew the soul cleans itself with water. They knew also that dreams mattered. If someone dreamed of running, of falling, of being chased, they sat with them and listened, not to interpret, but to witness. Because they knew what? The soul cannot speak by day, it whispers by night. Sometimes the healing began with laughter. Real laughter after days of stillness. A child giggling at a passing chicken. An elder chuckling at a remembered joke. That sudden burst of joy that returned color to the face. And they knew, the soul is still here. The soul remembers light. They honored those moments as deeply as they honored prayer. There were other rituals too. Writing a name in the dirt and letting the rain wash it away. Placing a bowl of water beneath the bed to catch bad dreams. Braiding the hair of a child who had nightmares, as if weaving protection into each strand. They didn't call these things therapy. They called them necessary. They knew that sorrow, when unattended, becomes sickness, that regret curdles the blood. That guilt, held too tightly, stiffens the back. That silence, kept too long, suffocates the breath. So they created spaces, small and sacred, where the soul could speak again. A bench under a tree, a stool beside the stove, a walk in the early light, a corner where someone could sit, say nothing, and be held anyway. Even food carried soul healing. The dishes made by old hands, seasoned with memory. The bread kneaded with prayers. The stew stirred while humming the same lullaby the sick heard as children. These were not just meals. They were messages that said, you still belong. You are still loved. You do not need to be strong right now. And when the body did begin to mend, they made room for the soul to catch up. They didn't rush people back into routine. They let them linger. Let them sit longer at the table. Let them walk slower into the morning. Because they knew, true healing takes the whole of you. Not just the cells, not just the fever, not just the wound, but the part that carries grief, the part that lost faith, the part that stopped singing. And when that part finally stirred, when the soul lifted its eyes again, they celebrated. Quietly, with a touch, a smile, a candle lit just before sunset, a soft blessing as the day closed. Among the poor, the body mattered, but the soul was the true patient, and to leave it behind to heal only the surface was never enough. They knew, and because they knew, they healed deeper than most. What we forgot, and what still lives in us. We live now in a world of speed, of machines that scan the body, of pills for every ache, of sterile rooms and blinking lights. We have knowledge, yes, but often we've forgotten wisdom. We've forgotten what the poor once knew in their bones, that healing isn't something you do to the body, it's something you do with it. That recovery isn't just about stopping pain, it's about listening to it. That the soul is never separate from the skin. That care is not measured in minutes, but in presence. Today, we call people when they're sick. Back then, we showed up. Today, we medicate silence. They used it as medicine. Today, we outsource healing to professionals. They saw it as a sacred responsibility, shared by hands, by hearts, by everyone under one roof. We've forgotten the patience it takes to sit beside someone in pain without trying to fix them. We've forgotten how to read the rhythm of someone's breathing, how to notice when the spirit retreats, and how to call it gently back. We've forgotten that a cup of tea given with true love can ease more suffering than the most expensive remedy, that a hand on the shoulder can make the body feel safe again. That singing, slow cooking, warm baths, shared silence, and bedtime stories aren't just comfort, they're therapy. And yet, this wisdom is not gone. It lives in you. In your fingertips when you rub someone's back without thinking. In the way you check the forehead of someone you love. In the way you whisper, just rest, I'll stay here. It lives in your memories of being rocked, of being sung to, of being fed with care, of hearing your name spoken softly as if it mattered more than anything else in the world. It lives in your longing for slowness, for meaning, for healing that touches more than just the body. It lives in the part of you that aches not for quick fixes, but for belonging, for quiet, for someone who will simply sit beside you and ask nothing at all. That part is still there. So even if the world rushes, you can slow down. Even if medicine forgets, you can remember. Even if others move on, you can choose to stay. You can remember how to hold a hand without words. How to light a candle not just for light, but for peace. How to make tea slowly, intentionally, like it's the most important thing in the world. You can be the one who brings the healing back, not just to the sick, but to the overwhelmed, to the anxious, to the lonely, to the ones who have no name for their pain. Because healing isn't just for hospitals. It's for homes, for kitchens, for porches, for every room where someone is hurting quietly. It's not too late. You haven't forgotten too much. The knowledge is inside you, not in the mind, but in the soul. And the soul never forgets how to care. So the next time someone near you aches, don't ask, "What should I do?" Ask instead, "How can I be with them?" And let your presence become the medicine. Because in a world full of noise, your quiet love might be the most powerful cure of all. If this story touched something in you, remember this. You don't need to be a healer to help someone heal. You don't need to have all the answers, only the willingness to stay, to listen, to love gently. Share this message. There are people around you right now, maybe even someone reading this, who need to remember that healing can still be soft, still be human, still be real. Send this to someone who needs it, not as advice, but as a quiet offering. A hand held out in the dark. Come back to this when you forget. When the world gets too loud. When the days get too fast. When your own body asks for more than just rest, but reconnectation. And if you feel called to, start your own quiet revolution, a revolution of care, of patience, of healing that begins at home. Because the wisdom may be forgotten by the world, but it still lives in you, and maybe that's enough to begin again.